For this lecture, I think I titled it The Beginning of the Civil War, but I'm going to use this PowerPoint that you guys have hopefully already looked at, and I'm probably going to go through most of the war and just make some quick highlights about things that we need to know about the Civil War. This unit that we're in, I call it Unit 5.2. It will run from 1861 to 1877. It covers the Civil War and then the period right after, known as Reconstruction. The Civil War is something that you could spend an entire semester on that. I'm sure there are whole college courses designed and geared towards this 4-year war. But we're going to cover it here in just a couple weeks, leading up to the Christmas break. And for us, we're just trying to get big ideas and kind of some anchor stones, if you will, to help us understand what was going on in our country and how we were really put through a crucible and changed. So the assignment that I had for you guys the other day was to let's start a timer so I don't take too long. The assignment I had for you the other day was to look through this and kind of size up the two sides. After Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the South started to secede. And the war is going to begin in April of 1861. Secession started in December, and it took a little bit of time. James Buchanan said that secession wasn't allowed, but he couldn't do anything to stop it. When Lincoln was inaugurated in March, he had 7 states that were in a state of rebellion. They were seceding, and shortly after he took office, the opening battle of the war starts at Fort Sumter. 4 more states then will secede for a total of 11 Confederate states, and the war will begin in April of 1861. So the task the other day was, at the beginning of the war in 1861, if you're sizing up the two sides, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses? Spoiler alert, we all know that the North is going to win the Civil War. The Union is going to defeat the Confederacy, and the country is going to be reunited. The question was that a foregone conclusion? Did we all know this in 1861? Did the South really have a chance? And if they didn't have a chance, why did the war take 4 years, and was it so costly in terms of human life and destruction? So you guys did a great job. In class, we would have made a chart probably kind of like this, but you did a discussion board, and reading through them, you guys were getting most of the highlights. So I'm not going to necessarily describe every slide here. Population, crops, horses, bank deposits, factories, all with big northern advantages. The North is always referred to as the blue, and the South, because of their uniforms, was referred to as the gray. Railroads, you can see a much more extensive network for the North than the South. This is a good slide because it shows you over here on the left the dates of secession and kind of lets you look at the two sides as they're laid out. These orange and brown areas here, these are what are known as the border states. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware specifically. If you notice, they are Union, meaning that they never secede. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware never secede, but they are slave states. And that's an important, concept that these were states where slavery was legal, but they didn't secede. And when we talk about some of these advantages in terms of percentages or numbers, if those 4 states were to secede, then those numbers probably change pretty significantly. So these are very important territories, of course, right on the border between the two areas. And in the next lecture, we'll talk a lot about Lincoln, but it was crucial for Lincoln to maintain control and loyalty in these border states, or else the course of the Civil War could have changed very much. Again, number of troops, leadership. In terms of a political sense, Lincoln is going to turn out to be a strong leader. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens for the Confederacy are going to be weak leaders. In 1861, you wouldn't have known that. President Jefferson Davis, had a much stronger pedigree, had a much more experience in government. Lincoln had mostly lost elections. So, that's something in 1861. If you were kind of betting on the leaders, Jefferson Davis might have had the expected advantage. But the way the war is going to play out, Lincoln's going to be very strong, very decisive, very clear, and Jefferson Davis is going to be handcuffed and pretty weak and indecisive and face a lot of opposition from like state governors in the South. This is an interesting slide just because it reminds you that the South, when you talk about secession, you talk about treason, and that they are breaking away from the Union. Their argument was that God was on their side. If you look in the middle here, that really George Washington and the entire American Democratic Republican tradition is on their side. They felt like the North was abusing their power, much the way King George III had in the American Revolution. Just something funny. This may or may not have come up in the discussion board for some of you, but this is the North's Civil War strategy. Because the North has so much more manpower, factories, money, they have a navy, they have a larger army, their strategy is going to be composed of 3 steps: surround, divide, and conquer. They're going to use the Union Navy to set up a blockade around the Confederacy. This will prevent the Confederacy from trading cotton. Remember, the Confederacy is going to have to trade their number one resource, cotton, for most of the resources that they don't have, ammunition, food, and things like that. So the North sets up a blockade. They're going to surround, including the border states, then divide. This is the middle of the Confederacy, the Mississippi River. Divide the Confederacy and then march in and conquer. That is the North's war strategy. It's a good strategy, but it's a patient, slow strategy. And when people called it the Anaconda Plan, that wasn't necessarily a praiseworthy name. That was like, why don't we just march right through them and destroy them? This is more of a suffocate, slow strategy that Lincoln did not necessarily get praised for right away. 4 years later, it does end up working, but again, at great cost. Here's an example of this cartoon calling it Scott's Great Snake. Scott was Lincoln's first top general, Winfield Scott, and I think that's kind of a negative term, Scott's Great Snake. Many of you talked about this in the discussion board, the leadership. The South had the stronger military leadership. I'm going to skip up all these guys here for the Confederates. These are guys who are well respected, had good experience in the Mexican-American War, a lot of like West Point graduates. And Robert E. Lee is essentially the most famous and top commander in America at this time. He was the one who had actually captured John Brown when John Brown did his raid at Harper's Ferry. It was Robert E. Lee and his companions that arrested and stopped John Brown. So the South has the expected advantage with military leadership. Lincoln has guys. Some of these generals are okay or have pedigree. McClellan had pedigree. George Meade had a little bit of history. Ulysses S. Grant actually had probably poor history in terms of he had actually been dishonorably discharged for a period of time in the 1850s. But the problem that Lincoln had is that these generals all felt that they knew better than Lincoln. And in a military sense, they may have. Lincoln has no military experience, and now he's commander-in-chief. These guys all want to kind of call the shots and do their own thing. And essentially, they always felt if they had the tactical advantage, the numbers and the position, that they did not necessarily have to go on the offensive and risk lives. They could wait out. They could wait for the South to misstep. What Lincoln found, especially late in the war, is the best way for the Union to win was to go on the offensive. And the reason he liked Ulysses S. Grant so much towards the end of the war was that Grant would attack, whereas McClellan and Meade and others tended to play the waiting game. A little bit here about ironclad warships. That's the first time that you're going to see that. The Battle of Antietam, it's a good trivia fact. The bloodiest single day of the war, an incredible amount of casualties there on September 17th, 1862. This battle is going to be important. It is, I wouldn't call it the turning point of the war, but it is a turning point because it's going to set the stage for the Emancipation Proclamation. In the middle of the war, Lincoln will issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And we'll talk a lot about this in the next lecture. So I'm going to kind of skip over it here. But beginning at the end of 1862 and the beginning of 1863, the war and the purpose of the war is going to start to shift. After Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were recruited. The famous 54th Massachusetts, this is what the movie Glory is all about with Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington. I actually have a clip from that I would sometimes show in class. But all black fighting regiments. Now, the actual turning point of the war is not super clear, but it is in these slides here. Two battles are going to mark the turning point of the war. The Battle of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, these are two battles that essentially take place at the same time, but in two different places. The Battle of Vicksburg is in the west, and it's on the Mississippi River. Ulysses S. Grant is there. The United States Army has surrounded Vicksburg, which is a fort right on the Mississippi River. And you can see that there's a siege taking place leading up to July 4th, 1863. On July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg is going to fall, and this is going to be a major victory for the Union Army in the West to control the Mississippi River, to divide the Confederacy in half, and begin the end process of conquering them. Remember, surround, divide, and conquer. This was critical to the divide part of that strategy. At the same time, taking place on July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th is maybe the most famous of Civil War battles, the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a 3-day battle. The Confederates won day 1 and day 2. It was very nearly a monumental victory for the Confederates. But then the Union won on day 3 because Robert E. Lee made a bad decision with what was called Pickett's Charge. He had a falling out with his right-hand man, James Longstreet. And this will be the last aggressive offensive move of the Confederacy. Gettysburg, just so you know, it's in Pennsylvania. And what Lee was trying to do was invade the North, to not play defense, but to go on offense and just kind of strike a blow to the Union's will to continue the war. If he had won at Gettysburg, support for Lincoln and support for the war in the North probably would have crumbled. So this was kind of like the South's last gasp. And when the Union wins on day 3 of Gettysburg, it essentially puts the Confederacy on retreat for the rest of the war. And it's the beginning of the end, even though the war will still last almost another 2 years, about a year and a half or so. Not going to go over this too much right now. You can read about this. But while Southern, generally Democratic legislators were out of Congress when they had left because of secession, the Northern, largely Republican Congress passed several pieces of legislation. Here's some stuff about the Civil War draft. I'm going to have you do a secondary source reading on that tomorrow, so I won't go over this too much. Both sides of the war use a draft and different recruitment strategies. It's not popular, especially in the North. And there are serious class divisions and social divisions resulting because of the war and the draft. I'm going to skip through that. I will say, because I don't think this comes up in the readings, Northern Democrats who opposed the war were known as Copperheads. And these were essentially opponents of Lincoln. These were people that Lincoln had to constantly kind of contend with as he made war plans. They just said, make peace and let the South leave. And Lincoln was not going to let that happen. And he goes to great measures, sometimes unconstitutional measures, in terms of silencing free speech, arresting Copperheads without charge, not giving them a fair trial, and instead doing military tribunals. Lincoln did a lot of aggressive things to silence the peace movement or the Copperhead movement during the Civil War. A few last things before we wrap this up. In 1864, it was an election year, and Lincoln was actually running against his old general. McClellan had become one of those peace Democrats. And if you look at the election, Lincoln wins big. He gets more popular vote, more electoral votes than he did in 1860. Of course, the southern states aren't part of this. And it looks like, oh, Lincoln wins in a landslide. This was not a foregone conclusion. After Gettysburg, the war still was not progressing quickly towards an end. And in 1864, Lincoln actually had said he thought he was going to lose. As late as August of 1864, Lincoln was like, I have no chance at winning. However, in August, just a few months before the election in November, William Tecumseh Sherman led a march into Atlanta in Georgia, and had a big victory, essentially burned the city of Atlanta down, and began the conquer phase of that Civil War strategy. And Sherman's victory and subsequent march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah gave people the impression that the war was going to be over soon. And this propelled Lincoln to a last second victory in 1864. Just after Lincoln begins his second term, the war will end. We could talk more about the end of the war, but it was essentially Ulysses S. Grant constantly going on the attack, losing incredible amounts of lives in terms of soldiers, but because the North had the numerical advantage, they could still win the battle. So that's where, when you get to the end of the war and you look at the Civil War, total Civil War deaths compared to U.S. deaths in other wars, and it is Civil War that, the trivia statement always goes, more lives were lost in the Civil War than all other American wars combined. Of course, every death in the Civil War was an American death, because we're counting both sides there, the Confederates and the North. But also, it was an incredibly bloody war. I have a video that essentially says the Civil War is when modern technology met up with ancient tactics. The troops were still marching out in rigid formations and in lines, but yet the accuracy and the power of the technology to then shoot each other was just so much more accurate and powerful that we had incredible death tolls. If you remember from World War One, in World War One, both sides will essentially dig down into the ground, into the trenches, because of that same phenomenon. In the Civil War, there are no trenches; they just march out, and it is a terrible destruction. So the North will overcome the South. I think the famous line is the South will lose because of shortages of men and food and supplies, and the North's numerical might in the end does overcome. Few last minute things. I know this is getting close to 20 minutes. Lincoln is the only president in U.S. history whose essentially entire time as president is encompassed by war. The war begins about a month after he takes office, and 5 days after the surrender, Lincoln is going to be assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth. So there's tons that we could say about Lincoln's assassination and the subsequent manhunt and the conspiracies around that. But it is worth noting that Lincoln is essentially only a wartime president. And that's where we will stop. I've said most of what I wanted to say in terms of the Civil War. I've kind of given you a trajectory. I certainly have skipped a lot, but please ask questions. I know you guys are getting tired of me just saying ask questions, ask questions. But in lieu of me not being with you to kind of prompt everything, I just need to kind of know where your head's at. So this was an overview, and hopefully, if you have questions, you can leave them and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening.